What if one of television's most beloved comedy partnerships was never the secret romance people imagined, but something much more complicated, much more genuine, and ultimately much more touching? For more than 6 decades, audiences have watched Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore together and wondered what was really happening behind those famous smiles, jokes, and perfectly timed glances. Their chemistry as Rob and Laura Petrie was so convincing that millions of viewers assumed there had to be something deeper underneath it all. And over the years, Dick Van Dyke himself gave fans just enough information to keep that question alive. But there is one important detail that viral headlines often leave out. Dick Van Dyke was never truly silent about Mary Tyler Moore. He had spoken about their friendship, their chemistry, her extraordinary talent, and even his own feelings for her long before recent headlines suggested that he had suddenly revealed a decades-old secret. What he actually remembered was more human than a scandal, and perhaps far more meaningful. There is also a small but important correction worth making before we go any further. The title of this video refers to Dick Van Dyke at 98, but Van Dyke celebrated his 100th birthday on December 13, 2025. He has now lived through an extraordinary century, with a career spanning television, Broadway, film, music, and stage performance. That makes his memories of Mary Tyler Moore even more remarkable, because she was not simply a co-star from one chapter of his life. She was part of the period that helped define his identity as an entertainer. When Mary Tyler Moore first entered the world of the Dick Van Dyke Show, nobody could have known what the partnership would become. The series premiered on CBS in October 1961 and continued through 1966, eventually producing 158 episodes. Van Dyke played Rob Petrie, a television comedy writer, while Moore portrayed his wife, Laura Petrie. On paper, it was a straightforward sitcom setup. A husband, a wife, a child, a home, and a workplace filled with eccentric characters. But what happened on screen was something much more special. Rob and Laura did not behave like the stiff television couples audiences had become accustomed to seeing. They teased each other. They disagreed. They laughed. They occasionally became irritated with one another. They had misunderstandings that felt recognizable rather than exaggerated. Most importantly, they appeared to genuinely enjoy being around each other. That quality became one of the defining strengths of the series. Dick Van Dyke later reflected on how believable their relationship appeared. He understood that audiences were responding to something unusual. The relationship between Rob and Laura felt like a real marriage rather than two actors simply delivering romantic dialogue. CBS has highlighted Van Dyke's own description of the characters as a modern couple whose relationship felt authentic to viewers. And that authenticity is exactly where the rumors began. When two actors spend years portraying a married couple, their chemistry can become almost impossible for audiences to separate from their real personalities. Van Dyke and Moore had extraordinary comedic timing together. One could begin a reaction, and the other seemed to know exactly where the moment was going. A glance could become a joke. A pause could become the punchline. A tiny movement could completely change a scene. That kind of chemistry is difficult to manufacture. But chemistry does not automatically mean romance. That distinction is important when discussing Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore, because the truth is actually more interesting than the rumor. Van Dyke has openly acknowledged that he developed a crush on Moore during their time working together. The existence of that feeling has been discussed publicly for years. But a crush is not the same thing as an affair, and there is no responsible reason to turn an acknowledged attraction into a secret relationship without evidence. The two performers were building a television marriage while living their own lives away from the cameras. Their professional relationship required them to create affection, intimacy, humor, arguments, and reconciliation on a regular basis. Naturally, the emotional rhythm they developed could feel powerful. Imagine spending years standing beside the same person, rehearsing scenes together, performing in front of audiences, learning exactly how they deliver a line, knowing when they are about to laugh, and understanding their instincts almost before they act on them. That level of familiarity can create a bond without requiring a romantic relationship. And that may be exactly what happened. Van Dyke has recalled that he and Moore could get caught in fits of laughter together. Their ability to make each other laugh became part of the magic audiences saw on screen. It was not simply about the jokes written by the writers. It was about the performers responding to each other. That is one reason their scenes continue to feel fresh decades later. The most important thing about their relationship may actually be what they did not do. There is no reliable evidence establishing that Van Dyke and Moore carried on the secret affair that sensational headlines sometimes imply. The documented story is far less scandalous. Van Dyke acknowledged his feelings, admired Moore tremendously, and continued to regard her as one of the greatest performers he had ever worked with. When Moore died in January 2017, his public comments were filled with admiration and grief rather than sensational revelations. Just one day after Moore's death, Van Dyke spoke about the first time he met her and remembered being struck by her beauty, and then by how quickly she demonstrated her comedic ability. He ultimately described her as the best there ever was. That statement tells us something important about how he viewed her. He was not simply remembering a famous actress. He was remembering a performer whose instincts had impressed him from the beginning. Van Dyke also spoke about how proud he had been of Moore's career. In another tribute, he expressed the extraordinary depth of his admiration for her, saying that is a very different story from the dramatic version suggested by some clickbait headlines. The real story is not that Dick Van Dyke suddenly exposed a secret after decades of silence. The real story is that he never stopped talking about what Mary Tyler Moore meant to him. And perhaps that makes his memories even more powerful. Mary Tyler Moore was not destined outside of her family. He did not think anyone was more proud of her than he was. To remain simply Laura Petrie. After the Dick Van Dyke Show ended, she went on to create another iconic character, Mary Richards, in the Mary Tyler Moore Show. That series transformed her into one of the most important television stars of her generation. Her character was independent, professional, single, ambitious, and surrounded by a world that reflected changing attitudes about women and careers. The series became a landmark in television history. Van Dyke had the opportunity to watch that transformation from close range. He had first seen the young actress, who was uncertain whether comedy was even the right path for her. Then he watched her become a remarkably precise comic performer. Later, he watched her become the star of another groundbreaking series. That history explains why his admiration for her never seemed to disappear. There is something deeply moving about friendships that survive the end of a television show. Entertainment history is full of co-stars who became inseparable during production and then barely spoke once the cameras stopped rolling. Sometimes people simply move on. Careers change. Families grow. New projects appear. Distance develops. But Van Dyke and Moore remained connected in one form or another for decades. Their professional partnership ended in 1966, but their appreciation for each other did not. That matters because it changes how we should interpret the chemistry people saw between them. Maybe the reason their relationship felt so real was not because they were secretly living the same romance off-screen. Maybe it was because they genuinely respected each other. Van Dyke was an exceptional physical comedian. Moore could match him with subtle reactions, timing, and an ability to make even a small expression meaningful. They were not competing against each other for attention. They were helping each other create better scenes. That is one of the great secrets of comedy. The funniest performers are not always the ones trying hardest to be funny. Often, the magic happens when one performer trusts another enough to listen, react, pause, and allow the other person to shine. Van Dyke and Moore had that trust. It is why their scenes could look effortless. And it is why audiences eventually began to wonder whether the relationship was real. The irony is that their real relationship did not need to be romantic to be extraordinary. When Mary Tyler Moore passed away in 2017 at age 80, the reaction from Van Dyke made it clear that she had remained important to him for most of his adult life. He remembered her timing, her intelligence, her talent, and the special chemistry they had shared. For viewers who had spent years watching Rob and Laura Petrie, his grief probably felt personal because the characters had become part of their own memories. For an entire generation, Rob and Laura were not merely fictional characters. They were part of the background of family life. And Van Dyke understood that. He knew what Mary had contributed to the show, and he knew what she had contributed to his own career. The timing of their partnership was also extraordinary. The Dick Van Dyke Show arrived during a period when television comedy was becoming more sophisticated. The show combined workplace humor with domestic stories and gave its characters personalities that extended beyond the punchline. The official site for the series describes its run from 1961 to 1966, and its central focus on Rob Petrie, his wife Laura, their son, and Rob's co-workers. Mary's Laura was particularly important because she was not simply the wife waiting at home for her husband's story to finish. She had personality, opinions, intelligence, and comedic power of her own that helped establish the foundation for what came next in her career. When the Mary Tyler Moore Show arrived in 1970, audiences saw something different. Mary Richards was not Laura Petrie. She was a single working woman building a life and career in Minneapolis. That series became a cultural landmark and helped redefine what a female television lead could be. Van Dyke could therefore look back on their original partnership, knowing that he had been there near the beginning of a remarkable transformation. And perhaps this is why his memories of Moore carry so much emotion. He knew the young woman who walked into an audition. He knew the performer who initially had to prove she could handle comedy. He knew the co-star who could barely keep a straight face during certain scenes. He knew Laura Petrie. And he later watched Mary Tyler Moore become Mary Richards, an award-winning actress, producer, and television icon. That is a lifetime of memories connected to one person. So when someone says Dick Van Dyke finally broke his silence, we should be careful. Silence suggests that something was hidden. The historical record suggests otherwise. Van Dyke spoke about Moore after her death. He spoke about their first meeting. He spoke about her talent. He spoke about their chemistry. He spoke about how proud he was of her. Those comments were reported by major outlets, including CBS News, and they do not support the idea that he suddenly revealed a previously unknown secret relationship. What has changed is the perspective. When Van Dyke was young, he was talking about a co-worker and friend while living through one of the busiest periods of his career. Decades later, he was looking back as one of the oldest and most celebrated entertainers still able to tell the story himself. That gives his memories a different emotional weight. By the time Van Dyke reached his 100th birthday in December 2025, his career had stretched across roughly 8 decades. He had become one of the rare entertainers whose work was known by multiple generations. His centennial was celebrated with documentaries, tributes, and retrospectives examining his remarkable career. And whenever people tell the story of that career, Mary Tyler Moore inevitably appears. That is not because their relationship was scandalous. It is because their partnership was historic. Their 5 seasons together created one of television's most recognizable married couples. The series helped establish Van Dyke as a television comedy icon, while giving Moore a platform from which she would launch one of the most significant careers in television history. Their friendship became part of that legacy. There is also something refreshing about a Hollywood story in which the most important relationship is not defined by betrayal. Modern celebrity culture often encourages us to search for the hidden argument, the secret romance, the betrayal, or the shocking confession. But sometimes 2 people can care deeply about each other without turning that affection into a scandal. Sometimes admiration is enough. Sometimes friendship is enough. And sometimes the strongest bond between 2 people is the one they protect by refusing to cross certain boundaries. That is why the story of Van Dyke and Moore deserves to be told carefully. Yes, Van Dyke has acknowledged having feelings for Moore. Yes, their chemistry was extraordinary. Yes, their friendship lasted long after the show ended. Yes, he spoke about her with enormous affection after her death. But none of those facts require us to invent an affair. In fact, inventing one would make the story less interesting. Because the truth is that 2 actors created something audiences believed in so completely that people spent decades trying to find a secret explanation for it. There may not have been one. Perhaps the explanation was simply talent. Perhaps it was timing. Perhaps it was trust. Perhaps it was two performers who understood comedy in exactly the same way. Or perhaps it was all of those things together. When you watch Van Dyke and more now, knowing how much history followed those 5 seasons, the little moments become even more meaningful. The smiles, the reactions, the pauses, and the playful arguments are pieces of television history. And behind them were 2 real people who eventually went their separate professional directions while carrying the memory of what they had created together. Mary Tyler Moore died in 2017, but the character of Laura Petrie never disappeared. Neither did the friendship she shared with Van Dyke, and neither did his respect for her. That may be the most important part of this entire story. At an age when most people are looking back on their lives, Van Dyke has had more memories to revisit than almost anyone in entertainment. His career includes Broadway success, television classics, major films, awards, and generations of fans. Yet when Mary Tyler Moore's name comes up, the affection remains obvious. That tells us something. Some co-stars become footnotes. Some become colleagues remembered because of a famous project. But a very small number become permanent parts of each other's personal histories. Mary Tyler Moore was one of those people for Dick Van Dyke, and Dick Van Dyke was one of those people for Mary Tyler Moore. Their story began in the early 1960s, when 2 young performers were still discovering what their careers might become. It continued through one of television's most beloved sitcoms. It survived the end of the series. It survived changing careers, changing decades, and changing generations. And when Moore died, Van Dyke's words demonstrated that the connection had never become meaningless simply because the show had ended. So if you came here expecting a shocking secret finally being exposed after more than 60 years, the truth may initially seem less dramatic. But it is actually more beautiful. Dick Van Dyke did not need to reveal a scandal about Mary Tyler Moore. He remembered her. He praised her. He mourned her. He celebrated her talent. And he continued to recognize the extraordinary place she occupied in his life and career. That is not a silence being broken. That is a friendship being remembered. And perhaps the greatest compliment Van Dyke could give Mary Tyler Moore was not a dramatic confession at all. It was the consistency of his admiration across decades. The young actress he met in the early 1960s became one of television's most important stars. The co-star who could make him laugh became a lifelong friend. The woman who played Laura Petrie became a cultural icon whose influence reached far beyond the sitcom that first made her famous. And the man who played Rob Petrie became a centenarian, still carrying those memories with him. More than 60 years after audiences first watched Rob and Laura Petrie share a television home, their relationship still feels authentic. But perhaps now we understand why. It was never necessary for the actors to be secretly living the same story as their characters. They simply had something rare. They respected each other. They trusted each other. They understood each other's comedy. They made each other better. And somewhere along the way, they became genuine friends. That is the part of their story that time could not erase. So when Dick Van Dyke looks back at Mary Tyler Moore, perhaps the most revealing question is not, what secret did he finally reveal? It is, why did he never stop remembering her? The answer is sitting inside decades of interviews, performances, tributes, and memories. Because Mary Tyler Moore was there near the beginning of one of the greatest chapters of his life. And for Dick Van Dyke, that was apparently something worth remembering forever. Their story is not a tale of a hidden Hollywood scandal.